There you are, you see. Even says so. Linda, any further points from you before I start? No. We aim to finish about 7:30. Now, I'll just now present the speakers. First of all, we have Paul. Paul Smith will speak on trade unions, the right to strike, and the political economy of labour, the Trade Union Labour Relations Act 1974. Paul was formerly a senior lecturer at Keele University, and he's the lead editor of Historical Studies in Industrial Relations, which, if you're not familiar with, you should certainly have a look at. I think you'll be impressed by its range and quality of the contributions. He's also author of a book on the haulage industry and a number of articles on labour law, notably in Industrial Relations Journal and Historical Studies in Industrial Relations. Immediately after him, we'll have John Cruddas, whose topic is employment regulation under Labour from Donovan to Starmer. And John was formerly Labour MP for Dagenham and Rainham for 23 years, and a candidate for deputy leadership in 2007, and subsequently a member of the shadow cabinet under Ed Miliband. And he's written two books recently. The first one, The Dignity of Labour 2021, which explored the economics and future of work, whilst his second book, The Century of Labour 2024, marked the centenary of the first Labour government. And they are, again, both highly recommended. So on that note, Paul, I think it's over from me to you. So, Paul.
Right, okay. The title you gave, What have Labour governments ever done for industrial relations? And my work's been on the Trade Union and Labour Relations Act 1974, as amended in 1976. But of course, that was part of a wider package of that Labour government: Employment Protection Act, the Race Relations Act, the Sex Discrimination Act, and the Health and Safety at Work statutory regulations. So I've got a narrow focus, but I'm aware that it was a incredibly creative period for labour law by the Labour government. So the quick answer is the 1974-9 Labour government did an awful lot. And the follow-up answer is some of it was demolished by the Conservative Party governments, particularly the Trade Union and Labour Relations Act. I was inspired when I was thinking about this because a lot of labour law papers are very intensely focused. And I've got two quotes here, if Linda will put them up for me.
Okay, I'll try.
Well, you would do better than I would.
I hope so.
I'm in the Stone Age when it comes to PowerPoint.
Oh, God, so am I.
Right, well, the first one is from this bloke called Karl Marx. And I took a long time to find this quote from Marx. Somebody found it for me eventually. I thought it was on Child Labour in Capital, Volume 1, but it's on the address to the Working Men's Association, 1864. Next one down there, Linda. And he says, the 10 Hours Bill, that's the Factory Act 1847, was not only a great practical success, it was the victory of a principle. It was the first time that in broad daylight, the political economy of the middle class, by which he means, succumbed to the political economy of the working class. And then my second quote, you've not shown them yet, Linda.
I can't do it.
I think if you go to the left-hand column and click on where it says 2, that might do it. Go to the left-hand column where there's the summary.
I'll go through the second one because I'm time limited. And this is one by Bill Wedderburn, Lord Wedderburn as he was from about 1979. What the statutory immunities protect are social rights, because it technically, of course, isn't a liberty to strike. It's a liberty to strike. In substance, behind the form of the immunity, the statute provides liberties or rights that the common law would deny to workers. The immunity is mere form, and that's from the third edition of The Work and the Law. I've got a lovely photograph of Bill Wedderburn here that Linda cannot get up. I thought you were a skilled worker.
No, I'm not. I might be in a minute.
Okay, well, he's sitting in Venice. Could read many languages, particularly French, German, and Italian, but spoke Italian fluently. and loved going to Venice and Italy. At his funeral, we sang Bella Ciao, the song of the Italian resistance, which I thought was very apposite. So you can't show that one either. So what do I mean by the political economy of capital? I mean a system of thought that embodies the values and norms of the capitalist mode of production centered on private property and market exchange. And this is the hegemonic discourse that is embedded in society's common sense. Now, the political economy of labour, in contrast, embraces a spectrum much wider of policies, values and policies, from radical to marginal reformism, that articulate the interests of labour, and this is the key thing, I think, as a separate collective entity within an economy and society structured and defined by the interests of capital in all its forms. That's a very broad definition, but you'll get the impression that what I'm trying to say is that the Trade Union and Labour Relations Act, in its representation of giving rights and through immunities to trade unions, embodied the political economy of labour. Now, haven't you managed it yet, Linda?
No.
Linda, please click on the slide number 2 down the left-hand column. I think that might work. Just click on, that's right, now click. Does that work?
No.
Oh, all right.
Right, okay. Well, it was the Trade Disputes Act 1906 that is what the Trade Union and Labour Relations Act was modelled on it. And the Trade Disputes Act, so I went to a lecture by Len McCluskey, and he called it Keir Hardie's Trade Disputes Act. Slightly fell off. There's one, if any Labour MP, David Cameron, and it wasn't the Labour, it was the Liberal government that asked it. Obviously, the Labour Party asked for it, and they got it. And in particular, it was the radical wing of the Liberal Party with Charles Dilke, Sir Charles Dilke, as he was, that pioneered and pushed the Act through Parliament. There's almost no records about this. I checked his diaries. If he met anybody, most of his diaries were blank. He'd ripped them out because he was a very private man. But what the Act did was extend the criminal immunity that Conspiracy and Protection of Property Act had established in 1875 to civil conspiracy. And that was to neutralise a famous case called Quinn versus Leatham. It declared that picketing in the form of peacefully and communicating information was lawful, and that overrode the Lyons versus Wilkins case, 1896. Section 3 gave immunity to any person, so not just a union, any person who induced another to break a contract of employment or interfered with the trade or business of employment of a person, or right of a person to their capital labour. That overrode the Glamorgan case, 1905. And Section 4 gave complete immunity to trade unions, their officials and members against actions in tort alleged to be committed by on behalf of the trade union. And that overrode Taft Vale. So four very important cases all over the. And then on top of that, and it's almost certainly that Dilke got this put in, the trade dispute section 5 is defined extremely widely. Any dispute between workers and workmen, or between workmen and workmen, close shop, inter-union disputes, which is connected with the employment or non-employment, or the terms of employment, or the conditions of labour of any person. And the expression means workmen means all persons employed in trade and industry, whether or not in the employment of the employer with whom a dispute arises. So solidarity strikes are legal. General strike was legal, no, despite one judge trying to claim it was legal. And the Act provided the underpinning for the growth of trade unionism. It didn't cause the growth, but it gave the underpinning to the growth of trade unionism, which comes in waves, of course, and then collapsed. Suffered great degradation from 1921 and slow, and again in the recession of 1929-31, and then very slowly eked up in the 1930s. But by 1938, trade union density was 30.5, 6.1 million members. By 1945, under wartime full employment and statutory support for trade unions, 7.9 million. By 1955, 9.7 million. By 1975, 12 million, 51% of the workforce. Important to remember that a lot of those union members were in very weakly organized sections, retail, white collar, etc. But in particular, that quantitative expansion of trade unionism was linked to of a wider transformation that one could call the new unionism. And that was uneven across sectors, but was particularly focused on workplace organisation, workplace shop stewards and their representatives, often associated with engineering and car manufacturing, but much wider, much wider. And in particular, the workplace organisation, they often led unofficial and unconstitutional strikes. Unofficial in the sense that the union didn't support it, unconstitutional in the sense of not being in outside the procedure agreement. And new sectors were organised female, and that included female white-collar migrant workers. And within some of the unions, some much faster than others, notably the P&G, some were already devolved, got new content, was a devolution of authority within unions. And this quantitative and qualitative expansion within of unions became, in a sense, the trade union problem. Wedderburn called it a social neurosis. And I've got a very long quote here, which I'm not going to read out.
Put your presentation in the chat.
Okay. Yeah.
So people
well,
can open it.
This is not on it. Yeah. Yeah. This is one I deleted from George Pollock, who was the director, I think the director of the British Employers Confederation, which is a precursor to the Confederation of British Industry. And he's talking about where unions or workplaces take strike action amounts to a gross abuse of power. The so-called right to strike has become a fetish, and complains about the uniquely privileged position of unions within British law. He wasn't alone in that. You got The Economist, you got the Conservative and Unionist Inns of Court in 1957. There was a general public criticism of the Daily Telegraph, the Sunday Telegraph in particular, mounting a campaign against the legal authority of trade unions, the role of unions and the law that they had. One sign of this was the famous Lux versus Bernard case, which started in the High Court in 61, was overturned in the Court of Appeal in 63, and then resoundingly restated the judgment in 1964. And there it was decided that a threat by a worker to break his or her contract of employment
Oh my God. Help, what's happened?
I think. And to combine to do so was a conspiracy, and this included any union officers that were involved. And the Trade Disputes Act of 1906 afforded no protection. It afforded no protection because nobody thought of it. That didn't worry them. The group in question were white-collar workers, draftsmen at British Aerospace. It's often said that they asked for Lux to be sacked. They did not. They asked for him to be removed from the office. So this mounting criticism, the role of trade unions and their legal basis, leads to the Conservative and they introduced the Industrial Relations Act 1971. Suffice it to say, it wasn't a great success, and we'll leave it there. It's a different story. And while in opposition, the Trade Union and Labour Party Liaison Committee develops an alternative policy for industrial relations and a wider social policy. And I've seen the committee minutes, very, very close liaison. And Wedderburn had been standing counsel for the TUC during the industrial relations cases, and he's then drafts, and you can see that in the draft at University Modern Economic Centre. He drafts what became the Trade Union and Labour Relations Act 1971. He's the spirit behind it. And the spirit behind it is the Trade Disputes Act 1906. And he emphasized here, which is an annotated copy, the role of Dilk, where I picked it up, the role of says, got it right. So what he did was he redrafted the 1906 Act in modern terms to take account of the torts that the unions, the courts had developed in the 1960s, indirect, etc. And he was very, very keen that that act be formulated and had wide other parts in it which were not put in. They weren't put in for two reasons. One, the basic reason was there wasn't time, because the Labour government was a minority government and it didn't have a majority for 6 months. And then when it got a majority, it was, I think, 3. So it was a battle. So they took various things out, which proved to be quite a debilitating weakness, including on the right to picket, and the right of ACAS to certify that a dispute was a trade dispute. So that was the Act as 1976. If you see, I don't know where it is there, but broadly followed the pattern of the 1906 bill, with the as amended in 65, which I forgot to mention. I'm sorry, was the Labour government quickly utilised the tort of intimidation, and in particular the tort of immunity for inducement of breach of commercial contract, a wide definition of a trade dispute. Now, this was attacked from 3 different angles. 1, the employers were not happy at all. The CBI mobilises against it. 2, the Conservative Party, particularly once Thatcher becomes leader in 75, is adamantly opposed. And Geoffrey Howe is the link there. We tend to think of Geoffrey Howe as his rows with Thatcher. He was at one with her on this. He drove it through. And the judiciary rooted in the common law and its hostility to collectivism of labour, but that had been immunised by them. Margaret Thatcher goes adamant, incandescent, I've got in my notes here, during the so-called winter of discontent over the lorry drivers' pickets. They are using such language as allowing access to food, allowing certain lorries to go through. They have no right to prevent them going through. They have no right to stop them. The fight was won. But there was an important judicial change in the case United Biscuits versus Fall. I interviewed Reg Fall afterwards about this dispute, and where Judge Ackner said a totally unlimited construction of the words in furtherance of trade dispute would mean Parliament was writing a receipt for anarchy, a proposition I am quite unable to accept. And he therefore gave an injunction against the picketing outside United Biscuits, whose managing director, by the way, was Hector Lang, who was a close personal friend of Margaret Thatcher. We have no evidence up to now about any telephone calls at the time, although you never know what might drop out of the Thatcher archives at some point. I'll forget that case was overruled in Dewport Steels, which should be there, which you don't need to focus on at the moment. You can look at it later. But the point was, the judiciary said we have to accept the act. We hand it over to Parliament, and the first Employment Act pioneered by Pryor is going through Parliament at that point, and that begins to cut, reduce, and restrict the statutory immunities as implemented by the Trade Union and Labour Relations Act 1974, as amended and established by the 76 Act. So, in a sense, after that, the rest is history, and no doubt John Grudders can talk about that. But the point is that was a powerful attack by 3 social forces with close interconnections, of course. And therefore, by today, what we've got is a narrow license to strike. If you want a modern form of the combination law, which confines workers' collective power to boundaries as determined by the employment unit with whom these workers have a contract of employment, and renders workers' collectivity transparent, therefore often very weak, and delays industrial action, giving multiple opportunities for the courts to intervene. As unions have got better at meeting the statutory guidelines for calling ballots, so more have been piled on. So the point is that Wedderburn's project to restore the right to strike via a modernised version of the Trade Disputes Act has been emasculated. It's still called the Trade Union and Labour Relations Consolidation Act, but it is not the Act as was in any way whatsoever. The political economy of Labour has been marginalised, and that is true also of New Labour. So since those 4 opponents, so to speak, employers, Conservative Party, judicially, you could add New Labour. New Labour had no interest whatsoever in strong trade unions. The statutory recognition procedure was designed not to be particularly effective. And So in contrast, today, the political economy of capital is a hegemonic force with a status impaled in modern British history. Trade union rights, liberties and immunities have been utterly marginalised. And so whatever Wedderburn achieved, and I should of course have mentioned, working with very closely, because I was under a lot of pressure here, with Michael Foote, who was a staunch, gave Wedderburn not quite a carte blanche, but enough leeway. And he was actually himself lent upon by the Lord Chancellor and the Attorney General about the judiciary's freedom to issue injunctions, but he couldn't get around them at all. So today, whatever the Labour government of 1974 to 9 did great things for the trade union movement, but it failed because basically the social and political underpinning of the Labour Party weakened and it lost the elections. And when it returned, it didn't have that social and political basis anymore, which is a separate study. Perhaps best summarised with what happened in Tony Blair's constituency, that the Labour offices ended up a few years ago as a carpet warehouse, which I think says a lot symbolically. Okay, I think I've almost done it. Shorter, Michael. A bit schematic, but
You say you've almost done it. Have you? Or haven't
no, I've done it. Yeah, I've finished. Finito.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. And now if I can hand over to John, who, just remind you, is going to speak on employment regulation under Labour from Donovan to Starmer. John, over to you.
Thanks very much, Michael. Excuse my croakiness. I've got a bit of a head cold, but it's very good to be with you. And thanks very much for the interview. For inviting me this evening. What I want to say follows, I think, very neatly from Paul's analysis regarding the unique nature of British labour law, specifically, I suppose, ongoing tensions between negative immunities, positive rights, individual collective rights, and how these tensions played out over time, specifically regarding comparative Labour governments. And his point about asking when were historic turning points, and his point about how TULRA was very much in the spirit of the Trade Disputes Act in terms of that gateway to immunity in a trades dispute. And as he did, to fast forward to today and say, how can we make sense of, given that history, the current employment rights bill? Basically, is it a radical departure from the approach of New Labour, as many of its supporters today argue it is, or can it be seen more as effectively re-establishing the sort of status quo ante of 2010 at the end of the New Labour era? So is it a sort of restoration of that New Labour framework or not? And what are the consequences of that? Not least in an era of fracturing coalitions, the rise of a different type of working class agency, if you want, in terms of Brexit, the politics of the red wall, the rise of authoritarian populism, etc., etc. So that's a fairly big chunk of ground. So I'll just start with a few historic points I think that everyone on the call will be pretty familiar with in terms of the history of voluntarism and the model of collective laissez-faire in terms of how we have sought to regulate or not the employment relationship through much of the 20th century, and basically, historically, account for the exceptional protections available to British unions as collective bodies remaining immune from prosecution in terms of inducing breaches of the employment contract. Basically, a historic consequence of the speed and timing of British industrialisation, in the sense of general unionism emerging before the creation of a political party to organise a working class through legislation. So the freedom to strike and organise was protected from civil damages following the Trade Disputes Act, which collectively shielded them from tortious liability. So voluntarism, the hallmark of British labour law, meant that the law kept out of regulating the employment relationship in preference for negative immunities over individual collective rights. You could argue, I think, more generally, pretty simplistically, you could say that Labour as a party was created to retain this separation between the law and the employment relationship following Taft Vale judgment, which had imperiled the right to strike and the viability of the union movement. So against that general framework, you could sort of jump forward to the post well, you can jump forward a few decades and say the unions emerged out of the Second World War politically and industrially strengthened through joint industrial councils, the wages councils, etc. However, by the 1950s, strains were emerging, low unemployment, labour shortages, saw strikes, and what we used to call cost push inflationary pressures, I think. The idea of the British disease, the labelling of the sick man of Europe emerging through growing concerns around comparative productive disadvantage, and increasingly linked to patterns of labour relations. So you see arguments are that voluntarism had inhibited growth, played out in uncoordinated free collective bargaining, reflected in wage drift, unofficial action, restricted work practices. And as was mentioned earlier, the right began to pick up on these themes. I think you could point to a giant strength in 1958. Some of the debates around the creation of the National Economic Development Council, very early 1960s with Macmillan. And in terms of a discernible Labour Party response, that's obviously interwoven with the emergence of the Oxford School, later known as the Warwick School of Industrial Relations, whereby it was well over 50 years ago, New Society identified this Oxford School considered central to post-war British reconstruction, primarily based around Nuffield. 5 key figures: Hugh Clegg, Alan Flanders, Alan Fox, Bill McCarthy, Arthur Marsh. Other contributors: Ben Roberts, John Hughes, Otto Kahn-Freund, and then other generations, pointing out George Bain, Willie Brown, Richard Hyman, Rod Martin, Roger Undy. What I find really quite intriguing is in the late 40s, Flanders was describing this sort of social democratic approach to industrial pluralism as a third way, which is echoes much later around Tony Blair and Tony Giddins in terms of their approach to trying to civilize capitalism, if you want. And obviously the point being that for decades, this group influenced the development of government, especially Labour government thinking around economic and industrial strategy, pay policy, labour law, trade union reform, economic democracy, much more. And basically through building institutions to moderate unequal power relations, as I say, to civilise capitalism and to lock in or literally incorporate the working class into the regulation of the economy. 64, the incoming Wilson government drew on this diagnosis in the consolidation of British corporatism, tripartite union employer stake architecture to integrate a discernible working class into a national project to boost competitiveness and anchor post-war social democracy. Let's call it an early iteration of economic stakeholding, should we say. Now, again, there's an obvious parallel or historic link to today, where many of its key figures came from what we would call the pre-war hard left, if you want, of Trotskyist or communist iterations, but through direct personal wartime experience of fascism, authoritarianism, that directly influenced their journey towards pluralism and the shaping of post-war democracy. And you could say today is crying out for a pluralist attempt to reconcile classes and help stabilise liberal democracies, with interesting echoes 80 years on of some of those post-war concerns. So the objective to institutionalise or consolidate the working class into the functioning of the economy should be a priority once again today, given the forces that are driving Reform UK, authoritarian populism, and literally threaten the foundations of liberal democracy. So that's an aside, obviously, but going back to the Oxford School, the Royal Commission, Donovan was the clearest expression of it in terms of their final report. Again, a direct response to mounting concerns about comparative industrial decline, escalating productivity shortfalls. The drumbeat continues today in terms of our comparative economic disadvantage and long-term flatlining productivity. And as we know, Donovan identified a pathway out of comparative decline to resolve earnings drift, unofficial strikes through innovative factory agreements to boost productivity and formalise labour relations, to reconcile competing systems of labour regulation by extending collective bargaining and removing barriers to union recognition. Part of a wider corporatist strategy of incorporation of the working class into the governance of industry to revise economic decline, but also to challenge the Treasury, not least in the short-lived pre-Sterling crisis National Plan of 65. More generally, such thinking influenced state merchant banks such as the National Enterprise Board, wider corporatist architecture, including Health and Safety Executive, Manpower Services Commission, ACAS, National Board for Prices and Incomes, etc. Now, notwithstanding tensions over in-place of strike for the defeat of 1970, Industrial Relations Act and the like, the Labour government, as was mentioned very clearly of 74, 79, re-embraced this voluntary tradition and sought to reenact the Donovan programme through 5 statutes: Trade Union Labour Relations Act, 76 amended, 75 Employment Relations Act, Sex Discrimination Act, what's the fifth? Race Relations Act. And one final aside just to that, actually, this whole Oxford school engaged in public policy not through a sort of abstract theory or textbook modelling or economic algebra, but through extensive research of the practical realities of the world of work. And contrast this with today, where there exists very little research in what is actually happening in the world of work. For example, there was no original research carried out for the 2017 Taylor Review of Working Practices, and compare that extensive research base that informed Donovan, or even the high quality survey case study research programs of the Department of Employment up until the early 2000s, or the National Board of Prices and Incomes, 65 to 70, or the Commission on Industrial Relations, the Bullock Committee, and later the Low Pay Commission under New Labour, all initiated substantial pieces of independent research into the world of work. So, but that, again, that's another aside. And we all know what happened later, as again has been just demonstrated in the earlier contributions in terms of the 79 defeat, Thatcher, the dismantling of the corporatist state, privatisations, the Prior Act, the Tebbit Acts, redefining the liability of the unions, the gateway of immunity, the definition of a trade dispute alongside deindustrialisation, the miners' strike, etc. I should add at this point, given what was said about the new Labour era and the limitations of the trade union recognition procedure, I should put my hands up here. I did an MA and PhD at Warwick Industrial Relations Research Unit, and in '89 I joined the Labour Party Research Department. My responsibility was labour relations, and from '97 to 2000, my job in Downing Street was working on labour issues, including the introduction of the minimum wage. The new recognition procedures that were touched on earlier, the working time regulations, social dialogue, social chapter, relations with the TUC, etc. So I'll just make a few points in terms of labour regulation under New Labour, because the usual script goes something like this: that New Labour was a neoliberal political project. Blair and Brown accepted wholesale the Conservative reforms, nothing was done. And I would argue that's a pretty one-dimensional analysis, although Blair didn't help himself. We all remember, I think it was during the '97 election campaign in The Sun, he proclaimed that under his government, we would still have the least regulated labour market in Europe, I think. But I would argue that there were different pressures within that government, and I would point to 4 different approaches to labour regulation that coexisted under New Labour. The first one, I would say, was the legacy of the Donovan era pluralism. The second one, I would sort of call as sort of globalisation realism, which saw maximising welfare of the working class was through remedial tax reforms rather than through the extension of collective bargaining. The third element was the growing role of, let's call them, European revisionists, which in turn also challenged traditional voluntarism with an emphasis on individual and collective rights. And the fourth element were sort of let's call them knowledge work advocates that sought to drastically reset the whole debate around labour, class and work. And I'll just briefly touch on each before then talking about the present Employment Relations Bill and where that fits in. In terms of the industrial relations pluralists, if you want, I'd say there was a group of people influenced by the old Oxford School concerns around nurturing, extending collective bargaining, promoting a form of stakeholding. John Monks at the TUC, Ian McCartney, who was the Minister of Social Responsibility, directly responsible for labour law. Bill McCarthy was still Lord spokesman for Labour. You can see some of the successes they had with the early CBI and TUC industrial relations settlement debates around the fairness at work agenda of the government, the white paper that led to the 1999 Employment Relations Act, the architecture of the Low Pay Commission, its tripartite nature, established July 97 on a non-statutory basis, and then the National Minimum Wage Act of 98. The Commission's board, set up with 3 employers, 3 worker representatives and 3 wingers. Actually, the key giveaway was the personnel of those who were in charge in terms of its Donovan era influences: George Bain, Willie Brown, wider attempts at earlier corporatist social partnership. I would point to the fact that John Smith, when he was Labour leader, had privately argued for a new national economic assessment featuring the unions as key social partners while he was leader. It never became public, but it was subject to quite intense debate internally to try and rebuild that sense of pluralism. McCartney himself was appointed as Minister for Social Partnership, I think the term was, but all of that ended really by about 2002-03. You can see it actually with John Monks going off to the ETUC. I think you can add in whistleblower protections that are in the spirit of Donovan and some of the unfair dismissal qualifying periods, the statutory, the rights to be accompanied in disciplinary grievance procedures, the Union Modernisation Fund, new protections for lawful industrial action against dismissal and discrimination grounds of union membership, blacklisting, strike ballot reforms. But I'm under no illusions that after about 2001, that tradition, its influence greatly diminished. By 2004, you had minor technical alterations to prevent union busting, prevent strikers, balloting procedures, and far-right entryism, actually, especially in the railway unions, I think. But that was one approach. The second approach, I call it globalization realists, dominated the Treasury and was influenced by Bill Clinton's New Democrats. The basic assumption was declining real wages across the West in the context of markets opening up, heightened international competition. It meant there was a fundamental question of traditional labour market interventions. The assumption being within the Treasury that those forms of labour market intervention could price people out of work and inhibit domestic growth. So you maximise the welfare of the working class, not through extending collective bargaining, but through new tax credits funded by growth and engineered through a compact with capital in the city. And I agree with this, for this approach, there was no discernible or traditional labour interest within the Labour Party. Rather, the politics of remedial cash transfers to alleviate declining living standards for the working class, especially young families and older pensioners. Alongside that, you saw a programme of refinancing the public sector safety nets achieved through an end of boom and bust, and henceforth sharing the proceeds of growth secured by a lightly regulated compact with the city. Basically, an inbuilt hostility to regulation, including labour market regulation, which has echoes of some of the themes we've heard today and some of the light touch deregulation approach of the current government. Now, when we were trying to argue against that in government, they would say, well, hold on a minute, we've had 60 quarters of growth, 3 massive majorities in 97, 05 and 01, what's there not to like about it? So that's the sort of second approach to labour market regulation. The third one, I'd call the question of European proceduralists, with an emphasis on individual rights, equality and new international frameworks to regulate labour. with historic unresolved tensions in terms of voluntarism, obviously triggered in a very cold climate for the domestic labour movement when Jacques Delors visited the TUC Congress in '98 at the high point of Thatcherism and embraced a social model which rested uneasily with the history of British labour law. I mean, it signalled a transition to individual and collective rights rather than immunities, including later the '98 and 2007 working time directives under New Labour, rights to information consultation. And in one sense, sort of labour reform was subsumed within a wider European regulatory framework, in effect subcontracting that domestic political contest over labour regulation to a transnational judicial oversight. Now, obviously limitations around the European social model emerged, such as Court of Justice, Laval, Viking cases. But that tradition was also influential around so-called family-friendly initiatives, flexible working for those guardians of young or disabled people, people with caring responsibilities, adoptive parents, rights to paid, unpaid paternity leave, paid statutory paternity leave. So within Labour, you see this gradual surrender of that voluntarist tradition and embrace of more realistic and international approaches. And the final tradition I point to under that New Labour era was this focus on knowledge work. And let's call it the technological determinism, which suggested that the working class was on the wrong side of history. You see the expansion of knowledge work. So why need to regulate old labour or the old economy? We should embrace the new. And another argument, a case against regulation, as physical toil was being rendered sort of technologically obsolete. The slogan, education, education, education captured a new tech-savvy, meritocratic supply-side politics captured in a '98 knowledge-based economy white paper. So my point is, in this sort of long journey through this, overall, for different reasons, the Treasury and Downing Street, or elements in Downing Street, combine with support from the DTI. Growth was assumed to be locked in, welfare transfers to the poor within a positive sum economic framework were the rational route alongside refinancing public services. What's there not to like? Now, this is obviously all before a global economic reckoning, yet even before that reckoning, tax credits were allowing employers to free ride and wages and productivity were pretty stagnant. It inhibited genuine technological innovation. And later, I would say, these decisions upstream were played out in 4 Tory victories, despite a decade of austerity, and actually in Brexit and fracturing of class alliances. Meanwhile, under New Labour, union density declined from 31% of all employees 97, I think, to 27% in 2009, and the private sector was more dramatic, from about 27%, sorry, 20% to about 15, I think. More generally, that whole period saw a rejection of stakeholding model or any engagement with industrial democracy. Will Hutton's book, In the State We're In, sought to rethink the structure of the capitalist firm, the fiduciary duties, etc. But stakeholding was effectively dropped within the shadow cabinet even before Labour came to power in '97. There was, however, a 1998 company law review and a 2001 white paper, which led to the 2006 Companies Act, but that retained the underlying supremacy of stakeholder interest. So it was an opportunity missed, and in actual fact, the duties to represent non-shareholder interests were actually dropped by 2005. Now, so overall, since 2008, the big story is a unprecedented fall in UK productivity, stagnant wage growth, price rises, profound deterioration in living standards played out in terms of Brexit, the Red Wall, populism, authoritarian forces, etc. Theresa May, as we know, tentatively sought to rethink labour relations with the Taylor Review, but nothing in effect came from it. Yet, since 2010, what political economists of the 19th century would refer to as the Labour problem gradually re-emerged centre stage in political debate. partly because of COVID, where the market for labour stops. A Tory government helps to step in and regulate who works, where, and under what conditions, which is a bit of a change of terrain compared to the earlier Thatcher legislation and view of the labour market. Corporatism re-emerged. The TUC helped to forge the most significant labour market intervention in living memory in terms of a state furlough programme covering 11 million workers. Also within Labour, during the Corbyn years, a major strategic rethink around employment law took place, significantly toughening up its approach and turning the clock to the pre-Thatcherite period of negative immunities. And this agenda post-Corbyn looked to be consolidated under Starmer. In the summer of 2021, Labour launched a New Deal for Working People campaign, in which Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner pledged, quote, to make Britain the best place to work based on 5 principles of good work. Starmer reinforced the message in a speech at 2021 TUC. Congress, his government would enforce full rights and protection for all workers from the first day of their job. Later, Rayner said, the driving mission of the next Labour government will be an end to poverty wages, insecure work that blights lives, holds back our economy, when unveiling a green paper on employment rights. So how's all this played out in the last several months? On the one hand, if you look back to those 4 different competing forces around New Labour, the globalisation realists are pretty unfashionable today. So too the European proceduralist post-Brexit, if you want, although a lot of that has been upheld in retained EU law. There is an emphasis on knowledge work, especially around the Tony Blair Institute and their approach to labour market regulation, the embrace of AI, which is influential in parts of the government. But everything else being equal, the environment looks pretty well set for a revival of a more traditional post-war approach to labour regulation, especially with a Labour leader who self-identifies with Harold Wilson rather than any of the figures from the New Labour era. And not least because of the contents of the original New Deal for Working People, which pledged, among other things, to eradicate in-work poverty, replace universal credit, to use procurement to ensure union recognition and collective bargaining, and extensive use of fair wages clauses. Critically, it committed to establish fair pay agreements through sectoral bargaining across unorganised sectors, a sort of revised Schedule 11 of the old Employment Protection Act, the creation of a single status of worker in law, give all workers day one rights, ban 0 hours, increase statutory sick pay, ban fire and rehire practices, provide new rights over flexible working, institute a right to switch off, provide more family-friendly rights, a repeal of all anti-union legislation, increase workplace access, remove complexities around recognition procedures, including lowering the thresholds, reform balloting, including the introduction of workplace ballots. It also pledged to align domestic strike law with the ILO and planned to reboot the HSA and provide access to justice through a reformed tribunal system and provide single enforcement body to protect workers. Also planned to reform the Equalities Act and promised the biggest overhaul of employment law for a generation through quite a robust mix of individual and collective rights, as well as strengthening immunities, or the gateway to immunity, in line with European logics, and getting rid of all anti-union legislation from the previous 40 years. Now, in opposition, there was some shifts away from some of that, especially around fair pay agreements. But the general shape of the package, its mix of individual and collective interventions, remains relatively intact. So then, how's it played out? Well, I would make a couple of points. First, is that in a general sense, the government has built on the New Labour approach to low pay, with a national minimum wage now, I think it's about £12.20, I think, an hour. Second, in terms of the Employment Relations Bill, published October the 10th last year, 150-page bill, plus schedules containing 28 employment measures. Although it has to be said, much of the detail is left to secondary legislation, extensive consultation, including a substantial transition period. But basically, to my mind, it's difficult not to conclude that it amounts to a dramatic reorientation away from the original New Deal for Working People of barely 3 years ago. The emphasis again is much more on individual rights, and many of them are ambiguous. Unfair dismissal will become a day rate right, but the caveat of consultation around probationary periods. And it's only available to employees rather than a redefined category of worker. Fire and hire rehire is gone, with a couple of exceptions. It introduces a number of notable changes to harassment under the Equalities Act. Plans to end exploitative 0 hours contracts, which includes exemptions around genuine temporary work, offers more limited expansion of rights to flexible working, again, only to employees, and is only a right to request. Does not ensure all workers, sorry, it does ensure that all workers are entitled to statutory sick pay, does provide parental and paternity leave as day one rights, as well as boosting maternity provision. In terms of the recent Tory legislation, it does take aim at it in terms of the attacks of union activities of the Trade Union Act 2016, including over industrial action ballots, the role of certification officer in terms of the operation of strikes, and the Strikes Minimum Service Levels Act. And it does plan to alter the access and recognition procedures, including ballot thresholds. However, and as well as the Employment Relations Bill, the third point I'd make is over and above that, there's also the right to switch off is being processed through a statutory code of practice. It's also extending pay gap reporting, providing a full review of parental leave and carers leave, and critically, it is consulting on the key issue of employment status, including moves to a single status. Also calling for evidence, I think, around tubing regulation. All of that is a lot of significant improvements. However, despite commitments to repeal all anti-union legislation, the basic architecture of the Thatcher settlement remains untouched. Alongside this, the ILO commitment has gone, so too the workplace balloting commitment. So in conclusion, so I'm going on a bit, the Thatcher legacy remains pretty much untouched in terms of the role of unions in the economy. This is not a programme to rebuild labour as an economic category, if you want. The extension of negotiated terms and conditions into unorganised sectors through fair pay agreements, arguably the most significant element of the New Deal, has been eroded down to social care staff and those in school support in England, leaving millions uncovered. Without such protections, all roads then lead you back to new labour's recognition procedure. And here what is basically offered is pretty much the same with a few technical changes. So the radical reorientation of the New Deal was around fair pay agreements and single status, and both have been much more diminished interventions. It was signalled in opposition, and it still will be a critical help to those in those key sectors, even though how much it will actually advance collective bargaining in those sectors is still unclear. So too is how it will be extended into other sectors. So the cornerstone of the individual rights package as well, single status, is subject to full and detailed consultation. And without that single status, the bill allocates a series of individual rights very much in line with those established under New Labour, and remaining ambiguous who is still defined as New Labour. So overall, it seems to me the legislation should be seen firstly as a land clearance to clear out much of the recent Tory legislation. Second, as a framework to widen and deepen a number of the individual rights introduced under New Labour, especially offender-friendly initiatives, and consolidate the retained EU law. And thirdly, as a slight adaptation of the basic approach to collective voice adapted under New Labour, specifically the recognition procedure. A substantial package, but very different from that was promised. Is it a departure from New Labour? I don't think so. Will it actually rebuild the dignity of labour in a wider sense? I fear it won't. One final point are things that are omitted. There is little talk about the extension of collective bargaining as an act of public policy through utilising all arms of the state. Industrial democracy still remains a path not travelled in terms of works councils, worker directors, nothing about review of company law and the supremacy of shareholder interests, nothing about economic democracy, worker ownership funds that were floated, nothing about a new Department of Labour. So I would say it's pretty much mixed bag. And overall, in terms of labour law from Donovan to Starmer, the key turning point remains 1979. And despite what was promised, it is one unlikely to be corrected this year. Sorry, that's quite a long walkthrough, but that's it.
Okay, John, that was not just a tour de force, it was a succinct and extremely nuanced tour de force as well. And thank you very much for it. And not just that, you've kept to time beautifully. I have loads of questions coming out of that. I'm sure the rest of you do too. Who would like to ask the first question, either of Paul or John or both? Don't be reticent. This is not the moment to be shy. Please feel free to ask your question or make a comment. Everybody's been bamboozled into silence, or no, no one's asking a question. In that case, John, I might ask you, I'll start things off. One of your categories was European revisionism or proceduralism. I mean, with Brexit, where do you see that going? I mean, is it possible for the UK still to shadow European employment legislation? Or is that really off the cards now? I mean, given the fact that Europe gave us European Works Councils, all the things you mentioned, part-time work directives, agency work directives, great long list. I think there were about 70 directives, all of it very progressive, actually. And the thing that worries me now, particularly with the European Works Council directive, is Brexit, of course, then frees employers from that obligation. And the more unscrupulous ones, particularly American multinationals, are already availing themselves of that. I mean, what's the chance, do you think, of the UK paralleling EU developments in that sense?
I wouldn't be optimistic. Partly because even since the publication of the Employment Relations Bill, this steady drumbeat of over-regulating the labour market through the national insurance increases the minimum wage, and what is seen as this very robust package of workers' rights, given the fact that the volume's being turned up on their argument about their over-regulating, and the government response seems to be a wider strategy of demonstrating their deregulatory bona fides around planning, housing, whatever. You wonder what will remain intact through this consultation period, let alone embrace a wider sort of European model, what's left of it. So I would see the real, I think the real question is what will emerge at the end of these periods now. Because I remember in '97, those 14 years, there was an opening of a couple of years to get some of this stuff in, and then everything else was downhill. You know, there was a short peak, and then nothing else came through really after 2004 in terms of labour market reform. I fear we might have seen the high watermark in this government, right? And which is quite ominous in terms of how the debates around regulation play out from now on over the next months and years. So I'm not over optimistic, as you could tell from what I said beforehand. Even though what is really interesting to me is it's not really a big debate within the labour movement. Really.
Yeah,
there's a lot of concerns, but there's no semi-public facing debate around trying to make sure that things are consolidating in for the next period, which I find interesting about why that isn't the case. But sorry, that's a roundabout way to say I wouldn't be optimistic of that European route.
No, okay. I've got two questions. First of all, from John Holford, and then from Rebecca. So I'll take John first because I saw him first. John.
Thank you very much. It's very fascinating presentations. I'd really like to go to John and to address this moment that I seem to sense in your presentation around 2002, something like that, where you suggested that the sea changed or the mood changed in terms of the willingness of New Labour to go in the direction of support for trade union organisation. I just want to ask you where you think that came from. What was behind that shift? And I think I'm asking this because one can sense that shift in other areas too. And I'm wondering whether, in a kind of insider way, you have any sense of what drove that particular shift in New Labour thinking.
Well, personally, going back to that point about Europe, I'm not sure if this has ever been reported or not, but I think John Monks might have said it once. Tony Blair did give a cast iron commitment to, I think it was Adair Turner, who was head of CBI at the time, saying after the signing of the social protocol, social chapter, and regulation of working time, nothing more was going to come down the European channel. So that was sort of choked off fairly early. There was an assumption that there would be a employment relations bill, but there was no guarantees about anything else. That interlinked with a growing ascendancy in the Treasury in terms of a specific worldview, which ideologically choked off the space for those who wanted to more substantially regulate the labour market. That actually played out, again, I'm not sure if this ever came out, this actually played out in attempts to split the Low Pay Commission itself in terms of its final report, which George Bain was brilliant at holding that together. But that was an illustration of some of the tensions amongst these different groups in and around Downing Street. And basically, the shutters came down through a coalition of the Treasury and elements in the DTI, which under Peter Mandelson increasingly embraced this knowledge-based view of the world in terms of the future demand for labour, which reorientated onto the belief that 8 out of 10 jobs in the future would require a degree. And this was a dramatic economic reconstruction, which did away with the case for labour reforms. So you could see a coalition of different groups in and around the government, which basically meant that the walls were coming in and the ceiling was coming down in terms of the case for further areas of labour market regulation. There was a commitment to review the operation of the Employment Relations Act, but that came to nothing. So basically, now that's not to say there weren't significant measures in terms of wider individual employment rights, but specifically talking about trying to rebuild the case for extended collective bargaining and rebuilding labour as a sort of economic and social category, if you want. That argument offered diminishing returns pretty quickly, should we say.
Thank you. Rebecca.
Yes, Rebecca Gumbrough McCormick Brookbeck. Two very fascinating presentations. I have one slightly naive question and also a second observation or question. My naive question to John Cruddas is, it seemed to me that you outlined quite a long series of very positive steps that were in the new bill, and yet you conclude that there's no major change. Is what you mean by that something you said earlier, that it's a return to an old approach, that is to say the sort of pluralist post-war approach, Oxford School approach, and maybe not even that. Sorry, I made a mistake. Are you saying it's in keeping with New Labour's individualistic approach as opposed to collective, as opposed to saying there's really nothing in it? I would have thought that reversing a lot of the anti-union measures under the Conservative governments was in itself a positive step. And my second question to Paul Smith, at the end of your presentation, Paul, you said something about what went wrong at the end of the period you looked at regarding the change in the social and political composition of the Labour Party. What do you both feel is the situation now, and is it more propitious in terms of promoting new and more radical employment rights, especially collective ones? Thanks.
Who wants to go first? Well, John.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't explain that very well. Basically, there's an awful lot in what the government's doing in this employment relations bill to be welcomed. Okay, don't get that wrong. But just in terms of the terms by which the argument was made around what was this New Deal circa 2021-22, I think it's difficult not to conclude that this more than anything reestablishes that New Labour approach, rather than anything that was promised in the sense of a restoration project that precedes the Thatcher era. And so that's not to say, I mean, look, and I'm someone who argues quite regularly that there was much more in the New Labour approach than a lot of what critics said at the time. I didn't think it went far enough, but there was still a substantial series of interventions, especially in the first few years. So I do welcome what the government's doing. I just think it's worth, in terms of, if you accept, right, that maybe some of the labour regulatory issues, declining living standards, inform some of the fracturing and challenges to liberal democracy today, then it's worth revisiting, going upstream of Brexit and all this, and accounting for asking whether it was a missed opportunity from 97 to 2010, which was played out with some pretty dramatic ways, and whether we should return to previous eras and rethinking a stakeholder model that seeks to reconcile classes within an approach to how you manage the economy and society more generally, which could allow for a more robust liberal democracy, not least. And it's quite interesting, I find. A friend of mine's just got back from the States, and he was talking to a lot of the people around Vance, and their argument is that this is obviously not true, but they're making a dramatic play for a labour interest as informing the new MAGA movement. And that tells you something, it seems to me, about how living standards and a failure to regulate labour and has played out in terms of recent years and the volatility of the political system. And I think it's all interrelated. And I would say that 1997 onwards was a missed opportunity, which has informed the historic turning point that we're living through now.
Oh,
Can I say something?
yeah,
That
cool.
question? Yeah. It's a question I have not been able to find much literature on. I've asked lots of historians of the Labour Party and the Labour movement. I've got nowhere so far. Is if we say or think about Labour voting was an aspect, if you want to use a modern phrase, of a counterculture. But that counterculture cannot be declared, it had to be created. And it was created through a network of interlinked institutions. The Labour Party itself and its constituencies, its unions, its union memberships, the cooperative movement, its branches, socialist Sunday schools, nonconformist chapels, local brass bands, etc., social theatre groups. And the weakening of that from the 1950s onwards, go around any industrial town and you'll see the deserted and abandoned nonconformist chapels. The one where I was baptized as a Unitarian has just been closed in Kidderminster after 300 years of lived experience. So, and campaigning via the web, sticking leaflets through doors does not create an alternative value system. And therefore, what I've talked about is the weakening of the social base of the Labour movement, and therefore the Labour Party, which is, as far as I can see in my brief tenure, I left earlier last year, was very much, in many places, an organisation of individuals with very little relationship between and across them. Couldn't even be mobilised at elections. Hence the need for more money, not only from unions, but from big business donors, which will not create an alternative culture. So that the demand by unions for rights to strike, in a sense, fell upon stony ground. I mean, Michael Foot and Wedderburn did the most brilliant meetings of the TUC Liaison Committee. I've got one here. 11 days after the election of 1974, the TUC leaders, Allen, Basnick, Green, Jones, Scanlon, Murray, David Lee and Callaghan meet Michael Foot to plan the act. And he says straight away we're in trouble because we've not got a majority and some things have to go. And then what was there was then gutted, and then they got it back. The things that were amended in the 76 Act, but not the things that were missed out.
Paul, you've faded. Can you hear? You seem to have frozen, Paul. I think, can the rest of you hear me all right?
I mean, you know, okay. many years cannot be declared. And okay.
Paul, I should just tell you your connection seems to be a bit poor and you're fading a bit. So
probably because I'm getting all excited.
It might be that, or it might be just the connection.
No, I don't talk. I'll try and talk directly.
I've got two questions as they come in. One on chat from Eleanor, and the other from Donna. I saw Eleanor's first. So I'll take hers, and she says, "If I may read your question, Eleanor, apologies, I can't come on screen. I have a simple but naive question for John. What does he mean by rebuilding Labour as a social category? I didn't follow how this was related to the policies and politics being discussed exactly. So, John, perhaps you could just explain how you meant this notion of Labour as a social category." You need to unmute.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, it's fine. Okay, you're okay now.
I meant primarily seeing it as some of the solutions lying in trying to provide collective remedies that rebuild a sense of agency industrially for a working class. And there are ways to do that. Historically, uniquely in the British way, that has been through the protection of those organisations from threats, financial threats in terms of inducing a breach of the contract of employment. But you could do it more generally in terms of revisiting issues of voice more generally at work through forms of democratic accountability within the firm, for example, in terms of patterns of redundancy or whatever, in terms of giving collective voice and agency through a labour interest or a labour movement. You could do it through, which I thought was a very interesting one, which had echoes of Scandinavian worker ownership funds under Corbyn to transfer certain elements, the ownership of production to collective bodies through the management of the firm. There are different ways that you can use the state or the law to seek to provide some forms of collective remedy, identifiable within sort of collective organisations, linked to articulating the interests of labour, and that's the thing that's where these fair wage agreements, I thought, could have been a really interesting way of extending into unorganised sectors a sense of a collective interest or voice, and we'll see how that all plays out, both in terms of the two different sectors that they have chosen and whether that can be extended. And I thought they might go back to the question of the architecture of the capitalist firm and the duties, sort of shareholder duties, and link it into the voice at work in terms of the collective employment or employees. But that does not look like. So the corporate governance is an issue that seems to be avoided as well. But and that's not that surprising given the history of industrial democracy in Britain and the history of British labour law, but which goes back to your point, I think, Michael, about European influences in the future, maybe or maybe not. And I think that comes with a deep cost in terms of the correcting forces that can allow for a plurality of interests that are reconciled within the body politic and the wider economy and society. That's what I mean.
Okay, thank you, John. Donna, if I can pass over to you.
Thank you. I should start, sorry, Donna Brown, Royal Holloway, University of London. I should start by apologising because I was working till late and so I missed some of this. So this might be a very facile question.
I'm sure it's not, Donna.
Listening to John talking about how the expectations that we had for the current Labour government and its law that might have, and its legal changes that might have made for a more propitious framework for trade unions, is quite dismaying. But also, I mean, I spend a lot of my time and energy as a trade union organizer, and I'm baffled by the silence which is now accompanying the dilution of the plans that would have been really important for improving the working life of millions of people in the UK. And I'm just wondering if either of the speakers have got suggestions for how we might change the situation, because, you know, I'm sure all of us on the call have spent decades being dismayed, but it's always important to try and identify how we can try and seize agency and correct this. Because, you know, for example, as John said, the dilution of fair wage agreements, which could have been transformatory, where's the resistance? Where is the dialogue about how dreadful this is, and how do we put greater pressure on the Labour government? Thank you.
Many thanks, Donna. Again, Paul or John, if you'd like to make a comment.
Well, I find this very curious as well, actually. I mean, I do, and I'm not. I mean, look, I'm a sort of insider in this. You know what I mean? I'm very much welcome a lot of the content, as I say. I'm not being oppositional here. I just find it curious, given that I don't know, this is just my reading. I might be wrong. I might be missing something here. But comparing and contrasting the New Deal as it was in 2021-22 with the current employment bill, I find it intriguing that that's not, given the emphasis the Labour movement are placing on this New Deal as a cornerstone of the government and the relationships that span the Labour movement. I find it very interesting that it's not it's not more of a hot button issue, and that maybe that's because I maybe just misread it. And I don't quite understand why that is, but that's partly because I'm sort of out of the mix, I suppose, now. But and I haven't talked to for quite a while some of the architects of the initial New Deal and how they feel about it. But I'm surprised that it's so quiet around this space.
Paul, do you want to add anything? perhaps you don't. If not, I'll go to Linda, who has her electronic hand up. Linda.
Thank you, Michael. I'm a bit surprised that there hasn't been any real discussion about the relationship between the Labour government and the Labour Party. I mean, I somewhat disagree with Paul on this social environment, because certainly during the Corbyn era, you know, the Labour Party was alive, and now it's dead. And so, I mean, certainly I live in Islington, so I'm particularly skewed. But but that's, I mean, it hardly exists, and financially, it just depends on now on, you know, people who have money, and so, I mean, there's hardly a party in many areas. So and so I wonder, it would be interesting to think about, you know, how far the policies actually reflect the state of the party, or the state that the party's been put into by whoever's in charge.
Shame, but they must go and
I'd love you to comment on it, John, Paul.
I thought that was implication, certainly.
Well, yeah, I think it's partly to do with there's been a very strong stranglehold placed over parliamentary selections and the parliamentary party. You can see that. I think this is today, seven MPs were suspended over I think it was on the two-child benefit limit, or an amendment to the Queen's Speech, and there is a question about whether they'll ever come back in again. And there's a really hard line. You're either with us or against us culture within the Parliament, which I think accounts for a lot of the quietness around this, because going back to the 97, we had a trade union group of Labour MPs in Parliament, which was a key site to push the government to make sure that earlier commitments were consolidated into the legislation, and aided some people in government like McCartney and the TUC in making sure sufficient pressure was put at appropriate times to bottom out some legislation. I'm not sure that that's occurring now, even though the trade union group is being reconstituted, I think, now in Parliament. But I do find it curious, the lack of debate around a lot of this around Labour at the moment. And hopefully that will change, because obviously the polling's not great, and it looks a much more, well, it looks a very weak landslide government of 7 months ago in terms of its direction of travel. What the model is for reorganizing society seems to be quite elusive at the moment in terms of its within the traditions of Labour history, if you want, of which that whole question of industrial pluralism is a key constituency, it seems to me.
Paul, any comments, or possibly not? No, right. I have a further question, if I may. I mean, I have to tell you, I'm a bit surprised at the lack of questions. I do have one, though, which occurs to me, well, it's for both Paul and for John, on corporate governance, because you mentioned this, John. In the mid-2010s, there were a number of corporate scandals involving BHS and Sports Direct, which led to parliamentary inquiries on boards of directors and their responsibilities. And Theresa May, when she became Prime Minister, famously said on the steps of Number 10 that we were going to have worker directors, or words to that effect. And in fact, if you track that through, you discover that there were changes made to the Financial Controls Agency. I can't remember the exact name of the agency, whereby corporate governance rules have been actually amended so that companies now have to have either a worker director or a non-executive director who is responsible for worker liaison, or I think a committee, or there are one or two other possible options. And if you don't if you don't take any action at all, you have to explain in your report why you haven't taken that action. Now, this is actually very small beer, but it does actually give potentially an angle into this whole area of corporate governance reform. And this was carried out by a Tory government, it was by Theresa May. And it's like 1 foot in the door, isn't it? I don't think it would have required much effort on the part of the Labour government to actually build on this mood of public revulsion at some of the antics of boards of directors to say that actually we do need workers on boards. And given that Theresa May had taken these steps herself, I mean, do you have any thoughts at all on why this hasn't happened, or why the hostility to progressing this line of approach? Because it's beyond me. It really is. I just don't understand it.
Takes me back to 2011, 2012, when Ed Miliband, then Labour leader, was talking about predatory capitalism and the need to focus in on pre-distribution issues, which got back into architectural issues. And there was a very strong move for forms of reforming corporate governance and forms of economic democracy in and around Labour that's preceded Corbynism, if you want. Now that closed down 2012-13, where Miliband got ahead of the polls, basically, and so we don't have to do any of this stuff because we're going to get in anyway. So this is all too difficult because it's unsettling to some of the other elements in New Labour who didn't want to touch any of these questions of system design, should we call it, or stakeholding or whatever. So, but then they did return. You're right. You did remind me there of this question of corporate governance and workers on the boards under Theresa May, which had a bit of a backlash within the Conservative Party. But there was a group of Tory MPs, especially given some of the Brexit realignments, that saw this alongside the Taylor Review as ways of consolidating the working class base to future conservatism. Didn't come to much, but that in turn should be an opening. I might come back to you on that, Michael, and pick your brains on it and bowl it back into play in terms of a path not travelled, shall we say, that's worth rethinking through in terms of industrial democracy. Because it seems to me that that would be somewhere that Labour could go. But again, I'm not sure how any of this would fit into the wider growth-based model as presently constituted, which is one of just driving deregulation in its various forms. But I might, if possible, I'll come back to you on that. That's an intriguing.
Please do, yeah.
That's worth remembering.
Paul.
Just a minor point. It's way outside my area, but one could do comparison of the Wilson government and possibly the Macmillan government and its growth-based model and New Labour and Starmer. Forget about, obviously, the coalition of Tories. You know, industrial areas, industrial grants going in, industrial training boards, golden age of further education, which was my first real job. The organisation of further education, not taking them away, they were left as organic institutions under local government control, but the courses were all remodeled, so they all provided ladders so students didn't get into bottlenecks and blind alleys and could all go up. Lots of literacy, post courses for adults. And if I knew a lot more, you know, it's easy to talk about the grand stuff of Neddy, but this was on the ground. This was on the ground. And the contrast, you know, under Thatcherism, just abandoned areas. And I don't see much development. You know, Heathrow, I mean, there's hundreds of railway projects that would spread around Britain that could restore urban lines to improve so people can actually get to work and not be exhausted by the time they get there. Somebody did a comparison, didn't they, of Leeds, travelling in Leeds and travelling in, what's the town, southern France? It's gone out of my mind. the big ports, you know, the contrast. There's tramways being built all over Paris. Just a constipated state. I don't believe that there's going to be a growth rate, except that that's what they're talking about. But where's the implementation on the ground? And everything else falls or doesn't develop.
Thanks, Paul. John Holden has another question. We're still within time, so please, John, go ahead.
Yes, only if I'm not taking up somebody else's time.
No, you're not. No.
I'd like to ask about, so no, I put it a different way. One of the things that has come along around the sides of Labour industrial relations legislation over the years has been support for trade union education and learning. We got that in the 70s. We got it again in the 2000s. Well, in the late 90s with the Union Learning Fund, and and then with the statutory rights for union learning reps in the early 2000s. We don't seem to be getting any talk about that at that kind. I mean, and the Union Learning Fund was destroyed by Gavin Williamson a few years ago. I just wondered whether we don't seem to be getting any talk about that now. It seems to be a rather painless kind of thing for a Labour government to do for the trade union movement, and yet we don't seem to be having anything along those lines. And I should add, trade union learning reps, of course, and the trade union and the Union Learning Fund were tremendously positive in relation to not only trade union education, but also broader education of the workforce.
That's a very interesting question, that, because I haven't heard anything of it either, which seems a strange omission, because it would, given the successes of the last schemes, you would appear it's a bit of low-hanging fruit that you could go back to and revisit. I wonder, I've got a curious view about this. I wonder, because when a lot of the dialogues we had leading up to 97, after 97, were done through the TUC, right? So the TUC held the ring in terms of the debates around the legislation, the priorities. It was done through the General Council. I'm not sure it's done that way now, right? I think it might be done more bilaterally within the Labour Party in terms of what the priorities are of individual affiliated organisations. And I think you might lose, I think you might lose that overall sense of prioritisation of some of these issues around union learning, for example. Other things in terms of some of the strategic priorities that might fall off the edge, given the sort of, not balkanisation, but it's become much more fractured in terms of pulling together agendas. More an assembly of positions to manage different, what they call stakeholders within, should we say, rather than a wider analysis and prioritisation of strategic interventions, which is how I understand the Union Learning Fund issues emerged in terms of the priorities of the sort of pan-union priorities, both of affiliated and non-affiliated unions as well. That might be wrong on that, but that might help account for it, because that's sort of issue's been nagging away at me in terms of why there isn't more strategic voice around some of these issues.
Thank you, John. I have a question from Manuela. If you'd like to go ahead, please.
Yes, well, thank you both for the talks, and I'm also enjoying very much these question and answers. And I was going to ask as well, why do you think there's no response to what I personally find a very mild employment rights bill at the moment? I'm very pessimistic, but I'm also very hungry, so I'm even more pessimistic now. But my question was, what's the process now? So now that there is a bill, and now that I think I've been to talks where, some have flagged some limits, some others flagged other limits. what's the process now to kind of address those limits, or maybe prioritize some more urgent, I don't know, elements of the bill? For example, I found it a bit strange that there was, well, strange, a bit disappointing, let's say, that there was nothing on union access to workplaces after, for example, the Amazon disputes here in Coventry. So, yeah, what's the process? Who is gonna give input, let's say, in the bill from now on? It's a question for both, I guess, even though you probably have different views and points of views.
It sort of goes, so just to jump in there, because it sort of goes back to my previous point about process. Who are the key, who is in this strategic dialogue vis-a-vis the government?
Yeah.
Whether it's more of an internal party dialogue, a management process. And I think it's more, I might be wrong about this, I think it's more of the latter rather than the former, which comes with a downside in terms of a wider strategic series of positions. If it means this is subject to individual management of different organisations within the institutions of a party, that's a very different proposition to a wider public dialogue. And so I don't know the answer to that, even though I do detect, I won't be wrong about this, just over the last month, I see a growing recognition amongst some of the Labour lawyers and some privately, some of the union figures, that there are, and people like Keith Ewing and John Hindley, who were architects of the original New Deal, there seems to be a growing concern about what this is, and the fact that this could be a one-off opportunity, the likes of which doesn't come around very often. I mean, we had this naive view in '97 that it could, almost borrowing on Thatcher actually, and the different phases of the different bills, that this could be an incremental series of interventions, which is very naive. But that was viewed as a possibility at the time. So I don't actually know the process, which I think informs the ambiguity about what happens next year. Sorry, I can't come up with any answers. That's partly because I'm not involved in any of it anymore. And it's surprisingly quiet and mute, given and I do say that New Deal is a very, very substantial package, and there was always going to be a reprioritization within that, and there was always going to be a sequencing issues, and given the scale of the proposed legislation. But I'm surprised, given where we're at now compared to what was envisaged then, that that's not more of a live conversation, really.
Yes.
Are there any final questions? Or actually, Paul, did you want to add anything to that? No. Are there any final questions? I've got Stephen, you're putting your hand up. Is that to kind of indicate you want to say something?
Yeah. I mean,
please do.
Hasn't the world changed? And isn't the reason we're not asking so many questions, we're not getting the dialogue, because we're not addressing the issues? And the issues seem to be, concentration of capital in fewer and fewer hands, and the polarization of wealth to very few people and very much money and capital. And we're not addressing the real problems here. The world has changed, and it's moving so far to the right. We just aren't ready to address it yet. We need someone of the caliber of Marx to come up with what our new situation is. Are we looking at the problems that we've got today? I'm scared. I think that we're heading into uncharted territory, and we're talking about labour relations and industrial relations and so on. But maybe at the moment the crisis is far more to do with, you know, global economics and changes that are taking place in society now. It's a dangerous world now, and we've been in a relatively calm world for the last 50 years. I don't know.
Well, that's one hell of a comment, Stephen, and I think we could discuss that all night. I mean, I might agree with you. I mean, think of climate change, which really is the most existential question that we're facing, and none of us are really dealing with that. But John and Paul, do you want to address finally, because I think we're coming to an end now gradually. Would you like to add anything to what Stephen said?
I think Stephen has a point in the sense that
Yeah.
scale of the problems look inversely related to the capacity of the politicians to resolve them. I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah.
That's why I go back to these fair wages agreements, because I thought, and actually the experience in New Zealand, for example, where they tried them out, even though that's been rewound subsequently, that they could offer, that I thought they offered a really interesting, novel ways of dealing with some of the contemporary challenges. For example, fair wage agreements across the gig economy could be a really pioneering form of intervention to regulate new forms of employment relationship and the like. And maybe that will come after the first one or two. If they get it right, they'll extend it and widen and deepen the scale. And I thought that showed really quite innovative thinking in terms of trying to address modern labour market reality. My fear is, unless this is done in terms of, as expressed in flattening wage growth, escalating cost of living crises, declining support for central tenets of our democracy, especially amongst the youth. This is sort of festering in very dangerous ways. And unless, and the declining significance of social democratic parties globally, unless that political tradition and the party in the UK and the government step up to this, you know, the scale of what's going on could wipe out the government. It could wipe out the Labour Party unless it proves agile and commensurate with the challenges that you've just identified. And that's a pretty big ask, I'm afraid, of which the whole labour market issue is a subset. But if you go to philosophers like Michael Sandel or whatever, they will continually argue that the question of how we value work and the dignity of labour is absolutely central into the wider stability of liberal democracy. And I agree with that. And that's why it's worth excavating history and our traditions in terms of what resources are available to help us navigate the modern world and some of these modern tensions, because they're not going away. And I fear they're pretty explosive. I mean, I was the MP for Dagenham for a long time, and we had a lot of experience of far-right activity. And it was a bit of a canary down the coal mine. This was before Brexit and, you know, authoritarian populist movements, Raj, etc. But that was all linked to patterns of deindustrialization, deregulation, labour market insecurities, etc. And they're thriving now. So I have a sense of foreboding unless these things are addressed in agile, innovative ways, like this fair wages agreements are, I think, as is single status. Actually, I think that could be another plank in this. That's why the New Deal, I thought, it wasn't a throwback. I thought it brought together some really interesting ideas that were up for the commensurate with the challenge of our time. That's all.
Thank you, John. Paul, do you have anything to add? I think we've come to an end. I don't see any more questions, unless I'm wrong. This is, I think, virtually your last chance if you put your hand up, if you've got anything left. No? Okay, well, can I just, this is rather unfair probably of me, but John and Paul, are there any final comments you'd like to make just to sum up the nub of what you've been saying? Any inspiring thoughts to leave us with? I'm sorry, that's a bit, as I say, it's unfair, but nevertheless worth asking.
Well, I suppose what I've said about the political economy of capital dominating creates, and the political economy of labour withering, and leaves a void. In fact, the article I say, and into that void comes other social forces. And John's really put flesh on that. And he's seen it much, well, closer as an MP, but I saw it campaigning in 2019 in Nuneaton. Labour won the seat, but because, on exactly the same vote, because the Reform took a load of the Conservative votes. The council is weak and withers, but you go down the town, a lovely potential town, Nuneaton, but hollowed out and battered and worn out. If it hadn't been for the Corbyn surge, there would have been even less, because most of the local Labour Party people were either on the right and wouldn't campaign for a very good local candidate, or they were too old and they were knackered. You'd meet them on the doorstep or demoralised. There wasn't a surge this time, but the Reform took the votes and the seat was won, but that won't happen again. Into that void, all sorts of things can come. Think of the way, forget about the end of the Cold War, etc. But when the Communist Party dissolved itself, it dissolved its base. And into that base moved other social forces. Their Turin has gone. It's a light wing. And unless you create the social basis of parties, the left-wing parties, you won't have a base on which to build. So when John says, you know, it was a good program, yes. How come that's been jettisoned? Quite simply, what I would describe as a deliberate oxymoron, as a constitutional coup inside the Labour Party. And the rest is history. I like that oxymoron, by the way. That's a lovely
right into that territory, but I would say no. I think that's the right. I mean, I think that's the right framework. I was talking to some colleagues in Hope Not Hate, the anti-fascist organisation, this afternoon, and they're just doing a massive survey of. And there is still this assumption in Labour that split on the right bends towards Labour as the beneficiary, because it means that, you know, the other side of the election, it was seen as very good that Farage entered the fray. And a lot of people still think a split on the right benefits Labour. But Hope Not Hate have just done a load of polling in the aftermath of Farage touring Grangemouth and Luton car plants and making a clear pitch for, you know, his script is, where's your party? You know, speaking to members and the like about deindustrialisation, climate change and the like. Anyway, but the latest polling I saw that the rise in reform since the election in working class communities is 4 votes from Labour to every 1 from Tory. And that is scary stuff. So ignore the aggregate polling. If that's what's happening on the ground in local communities, then I'm pretty fearful of what comes next. And that's why this debate around class, work, politics is absolutely central in terms of trying to get a route map through this stuff. And I'm not over sentimental or romantic. I mean, I was in Downing Street after '97 trying to work through an agenda, and I put my hands up. We got a lot of it wrong. It just seems to me there's an imperative to try and put some jump leads on this sort of stuff now, to try and create some institutional architecture that can uphold living standards, rebuild a sense of dignity in and around work. We haven't even talked about the future of work in this conversation, which is a whole nother debate. How we're.
You'll have to come back, John.
But you know, that's another subset around all this about, you know, where all this is heading. And it's incumbent of the party of Labour to be in that swim, really. That's.
Yeah. Okay, everybody. I, like a number of people in chat who are saying how much they've been fascinated by the discussion. I mean, I too have been very fascinated by it. And I would really sincerely like to thank Paul and John for leading the discussion. as I said earlier on, both tour de force. And I think the sheer range of subject that we covered and the insights have been invaluable. So, you know, my grateful thanks to them. Also to those who've asked questions and kept the discussion alive like this. Also, many thanks. BUIRA does have regular discussions of this kind, and please do look out for those which will be coming up in the future, either through London BUIRA or through the history one, or indeed Scotland and various other groups as well. So keep an eye on your BUIRA newsletter and you'll know what's what. So, okay, we're pretty well out of time. Many thanks to John and to Paul, and I think that's it. So good night to everybody and have a good evening. Thank you.